So my name is Per Wallstedt. I work as a support engineer from our Lund office in Sweden. I've been with Qlik since 2010, apparently. Doesn't sound reasonable, but all right. Let's take a look at the agenda for today. So we're going to talk a bit about new features, right? We're going to look at the enterprise improvements that's been happening in QlikView 12.10. Gonna try to do a short demo. It's not much of a demo. It's mostly just taking a look at how these features look like, so you have some idea when you're going into this, what to expect. We're gonna talk a little bit about configuration, recommendations from support side. I look forward to having some discussion about that as well in the Q&A afterwards. And then we'll do a takeaway at the end. So let's talk about QlikView 12.10. It's a new feature release of QlikView. So we do offer some new features in here. It's not primarily a bug fix release, although there are some of that in there as well. And there will be much more, of course, coming in the upcoming SRs on QlikView 12.10. So why are we releasing a new major version of QlikView? From support side, QlikView is right now a very stable product, especially on the server side. It's fairly problem-free. So we, of course, always get a bit nervous when we introduce new features. But I think you'll probably agree with me after going through this that a lot of these features are very welcome when it comes to managing QlikView deployment, and has probably been on a lot of people's wish lists for a while. So, and I think they will help out quite a lot with support issues as well. So that's it's pretty good. The theme of 12.10 release is enterprise scalability and manageability. So that's mostly marketing words, right? But what does it actually mean? We want to make sure that QlikView can handle deployments with growing user bases and increasing number of documents. Many of these features will be mainly benefiting large deployments, but I think a lot of them are going to be useful in mid-sized to smaller deployments as well. So it's not something to be scared of if you're not on an enterprise scale deployment. We are also looking, of course, at stability and fault tolerance within the QlikView infrastructure. It's always appreciated from support side. All right, so let's look at the features. This is the list, right? There's a few more stuff other than this, but we won't touch on them today. The full list of features are available in the release notes. And yeah, I didn't mention it earlier, but 12.10 is available on the download site right now, together with release notes. I believe it was released this morning, so go ahead and give it a try if you haven't already. There's improvements here on the QVS side, on the publisher side, on the access point. Some QMS API additions. We're going to look a bit at that as well. Some minor desktop improvements, and there's been some updates to system requirements. So we're going to go into a bit more depth on these features now. So the first one is QVS Scalability. So what does that mean? There's been improvements made to the QVS clustering and scaling, mainly optimizations regarding the persistent files. So we're talking about things like shared files, PGO files, general stability fixes. If you're managing a cluster QVS environment right now, chances are you've run into issues with shared files and PGO files already. So this should be very good news. I'm pretty excited about this to finally get rid of those types of issues. Concurrent users has been improved. This has been tested pretty extensively in-house by our scalability team. We're seeing about a 30% increase of users per time unit compared to 11.20. And that's before reaching bottlenecks on shared files and PGO files. So obviously you might have other bottlenecks that you're hitting, but if those are your bottlenecks, you will see an improvement with 12.10, or it seems very likely at least. We have some response time measurements here based on users. As you can see, 12.10 will handle quite a bit more users before the response times start to increase. So that's pretty exciting. There's also been improvements to QVS scalability. It's now possible to scale to more nodes. There is an old myth that we run into quite a lot on community or in support tickets about how it's generally best to avoid going above 4 nodes in a QlikView deployment. I don't think that's true even in 11.20 actually. I'm sure many of you guys are actually managing much larger deployments than that, but it's around and it's an old myth. So we think we've absolutely put that to bed with 12.10. Right now, there's not big of a difference between scaling more servers or bigger servers. You should see roughly the same improvement with the same upgrade in hardware, regardless if you're going wide or tall. So that's also pretty cool. And this has also been tested extensively in-house by Scalability. So they have the reports are saying that we're now seeing a very small node effect. That is a performance impact by adding more nodes. All right. This is more of a new feature then. We now support unbalanced QVS clusters, which basically means you can add hardware to your cluster, hardware nodes, with different sizes of CPU, RAM, number of cores, and so on, which wasn't really possible before. You could do it, but it was difficult to manage your core usage, and the load balancing was not great when you did that. So that's good news, of course. It becomes a lot easier to expand your cluster. If you happen to have machines lying around that you're not using, you can just throw them in there. There's a new load balancing algorithm specifically for unbalanced clusters that will be able to handle that better. That's pretty cool. And you can dedicate the money applications to specific nodes. That's not exactly new, but yeah. Moving on to the access point, right? So there's been a lot of improvements here as well. I don't know if this is a pain point for a lot of QlikView administrators, that the access point gets slow. I would imagine that will only happen after quite a significant amount of documents on there. I'm sure we have people on the call here who have run into issues with it, but I don't know if it's that common, but it's been improved in 12.10 either way, and it's been improved significantly, right? So the graph is also from in-house load testing by Scalability, and you can see there is quite a major difference here in the clicks per minute that you can push through before you start hitting some kind of bottleneck here. The throughput is around 8 times better. So this is scaling with both users and documents. You can have more users and more documents on your access point before the performance becomes poor. Definitely a welcome addition. A pure test in load time, response time, based on number of documents. So you could theoretically go up to 10,000 documents without much of an impact on response times. Compared to 11.20, that would actually slow down quite a bit if you went over a few thousand. I don't know how common this use scenario is going to be, of course, but it's good to have that. It's very future-proof. So there's also been improvements to the publisher, and this is perhaps the most exciting area for 12.10. There's been a lot of optimization of inter-service communication. So that's specifically to make it run better in high load situations. It's more reliable monitoring of task progress, improved task notification. We'll look a bit more on that one as well. Mainly, we're talking about the XML notification files that has been a bit of a bottleneck previously. There's a more graceful retry for failed tasks. It's also been a problem previously. And there are now configuration options to allow high demand files to be moved to faster drives. Probably something you will only even think about in larger deployments, but very welcome change. It means that any files that are accessed very heavily by your cluster can now be put separately on an SSD or any drive you have that has quicker access to improve the performance. It's often a bottleneck otherwise in large publisher environments. So in support, it's a fairly common support ticket, right, with failed tasks, and it's fairly common for the root cause for that to be resource issues. It's not always easy for an administrator to balance a publisher environment, to balance the task schedule properly, and to make sure that the tasks run in the most optimum way to avoid conflicts of resources. So there's been quite a bit of new features added here to improve this. There are possibilities now to pinpoint specific tasks to certain nodes, which wasn't possible previously. You could, of course, target specific QVS nodes to load documents, but to actually specify which node reloaded something was not possible. So that's really cool, actually. There is a possibility to reserve capacity for large tasks, basically having sort of prioritized tasks. And there's been much improved overload protection. There is now a queued status for tasks that are not able to start due to overload, which is fantastic. Right? We're hoping that these features are going to improve the stability significantly of most publisher clusters. So that's definitely something to look into if you're having problems with that. We have a pretty nice to have feature added as well, called Graceful QDS shutdown. You can see the little power button in the screenshot here. Basically, it allows you to stop the publisher service for whatever reason. You're performing an upgrade or you need to restart it. But it will actually shut down gracefully. So it means that no new task will start on that node after you press that button, but it will actually stay up until currently running tasks are done. So it will still keep track of any tasks running and make sure that the status of those are updated. There's also a configurable grace time that I believe will actually even stop new tasks from starting there. While I think that's actually for configuring how long the service will wait for tasks before it shuts down. So I'm not sure how useful that's going to be, but it's pretty nice to have. Oh, and it's probably going to be a question later. So you will still have to go into the services dialog to start the service again. This is only for shutting it down when that is required. So we have an expanded QMS API. I'm not going to go into huge detail on this. You can see a list of the features that are added here with a bit smaller text. I don't know if you can read it properly, but definitely go into the documentation and take a look at this if you're interested. The purpose of these new additions is to make it easier to create elastic sites. So that's pretty exciting. You can create something that will actually expand and grab more resources when necessary or add more nodes when necessary. So I haven't seen this in action yet. I'm really looking forward to it. I think you can probably build some really cool stuff with it. I don't think we'll go into more detail on that. There are some minor desktop improvements. So I'm a desktop guy. These are very small changes, but they're pretty nice, right? If you work a lot in desktop, having a search in the variable overview, that's been on our wish list for a long time, so that's going to be awesome. The chart properties, you no longer have those little arrows to scroll the tabs. They are actually multi-line, which was pretty terrible before. So that's awesome. And we've had some system requirement changes. These will take a bit of explaining, right? So we've added support for SharePoint 2016, SQL Server 2016, Windows Server 2016, iOS 10, IE11, and ActiveX plugin for Windows 10. So for SharePoint, that's mostly for integrations, right? So I think this has worked previously as well, but it's now been tested. I think it's mainly web part style integration that's been tested now. So you can do iframe and div integration properly with SharePoint 2016. SQL Server 2016, you've been able to load data from that since forever, right? But I think what's been tested here is that you can now put the repository on SQL Server 2016. So if you for some reason want to do that, it's now been tested and it works. Server 2016, that's pretty self-explanatory. We now run on that. That's pretty cool. It's been tested on iOS 10, so probably the web client and the iOS app has been tested on that. So that's nice. And the ActiveX plugin now works in IE11 on Windows 10. I'm not sure if it did before, but it's been tested and it works. So that's pretty cool. We're going to take a quick look at the features. We're not going to go into a ton of detail, but I think it's nice to see how it looks like. Right. So I'm showing here a management console running on 12.10. And one thing you will notice after installing 12.10 is that it's not going to look any different. You're actually going to be missing all these features by default. They do need to be turned on in the settings files. And I think there's a good reason for that. These are not options you want to mess around with unless you know what you're doing. And it's probably only going to be activated on a need to activate basis in a single node environment, for example. This is not something you would mess around with at all. So I've gone into my settings files and I've enabled my cluster node settings for the publisher. So you can see here I'm looking at the at my QDS cluster where I have 3 nodes. And on the advanced tab, you can see my configuration that I've created in my settings files. I have 3 distribution groups, A, B, and C. I've added 1 server to each. That's a bit boring, I guess. You could, of course, have these completely unbalanced and have multiple ones in one of them. And maybe you would call them something like a high priority cluster or something like that. There's individual configuration for each node as well. You can see which group it's in. You can see the max number of engines that can now be set per node. That's pretty nice. There's the admin one. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically just what the QMC will use. So for example, when you're setting up a task and you want to select a field to loop on, for example, then we spin up admin engine. I don't think you will ever need to touch that setting. 20 is definitely enough. Then we have the dedicated engines, and that's the interesting part, right? So you can now dedicate tasks to engines, which means that that engine will be saved for dedicated tasks. It will never be used for anything else but a dedicated task for that group. You can make sure that dedicated tasks run alone. So when a dedicated task starts up on your group, on your cluster node, you will not have any other tasks starting up there unless they are also dedicated. So you can really make sure that your high priority ETL tasks go through when they have to, your high priority dashboards go through when they have to. And I believe, I haven't tested this, but I believe that this grace timer here will actually prevent tasks from starting a certain time before a task is scheduled even. So if the task is actually scheduled and the QDS cluster knows about the start time, it will prevent other tasks from starting within a grace time before that as well. I'm not sure how useful that's going to be, but it's pretty cool. You can see I've configured here a number of dedicated engines and to run them alone. We'll take a look at the task. After I've configured this, I now have this nice little drop-down where I can select a group. So for example, you might have a group here called prioritize tasks or VIP tasks. And if I select that here, that means it's dedicated. If I don't select anything, it will run on whatever is available, on whatever has not been taken by a dedicated task. It's not so complicated, but I think it will be very powerful, and it will definitely help administrators setting this up, setting up an efficient task schedule, right? We can take a quick look as well at the services status. You can see here my power buttons if I would like to shut down a node without disrupting my schedules. So that's what you will actually see in the interface when it comes to features. The rest of it is in the background, running more optimized, more efficient, and with more fault tolerance. So I hope this will be a welcome upgrade for a lot of, especially publisher administrators. All right. Let's do some takeaways, and after that we'll move on to QA. So what have we looked at so far? QVS scaling. The 4 nodes myth should now be absolutely dead. Unbalanced QVS clusters. It's a nice to have feature. Access point improvements. It's going to be interesting to see if we get a lot of feedback on that one to see if people appreciate it. It might be something that people struggle with. Publisher high load improvements. I have very high expectations of that. I think it's going to make things a lot easier for support. Publisher load balancer, new features for load balancing, and setting up your schedules. Publisher overload protection. We didn't look at it now, but you will notice in your schedules that you will now see queued status when there are no available engines, for example. So that's pretty nice. And new QMS API stuff that might be very interesting as well. That's pretty much it for me. So I think we'll move on to some QA.
Excellent. Thank you, Per. So at this time, you can go ahead and submit your questions into the Q&A panel in the lower right corner of the WebEx. And Per, if you wanted to start with the first question, or the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm just going to take a look at what we got. And of course, if your question is my bug fixed in 12.10, go ahead and get in touch with support. Create a ticket in the portal. I won't be able to answer all of those today. 12.10 is definitely a feature release, not a service release. So I think the number of bug fixes is maybe not as high as we would hope for, but the first SR should be very likely to include your fixes. So yeah, I have a question here about shared file corruptions, if this will eliminate shared file corruptions. So that's a good question. I would certainly hope so. I think that from my perspective, I've been in support for quite a while. Shared file corruption is definitely a lot more rare now. It used to be a major issue in older versions of 11 and 10. If you have a well-managed cluster right now, I think it's it's probably not that big of an issue unless you maybe run with the more advanced shared file features. Maybe you're running big input fields. Maybe you're running with annotations or something like that. Then 12.10 might be a very good upgrade for you. But if you're on some of the later 12.0 releases, I think it's share file corruption probably shouldn't be a major issue if things are configured correctly. I would definitely encourage you to get in touch with support about that. You probably already are, but we probably should take a closer look at that. We of course have questions about if this will be recorded, and I see that's been answered as well. You can get the recording on the community after the session. So we have some questions about the iOS app as well. It only supports 1120 at current. So that's a good question. I actually don't know that. I would expect us to have a system requirements list for the iOS app specifically. I'll look into that actually, because it sounds to me like that would be the case, that in 12.10 it should be supported. So there's a lot of questions about imprinting compatibility. Of course, we kind of expected that. So you may note in the release notes that there is a small comment about that. There's a lot of work going on right now between the imprinting developers and the QlikView developers to make sure that that integration works really well. The reason the release was delayed now is because there's a lot of work being put into that. We believe that it will work fairly well on the current release, but if you want the perfect experience with this, it might be worth waiting for the first SR of 12.10 to have absolute compatibility. There is a little note in the release notes if you want to take a look at that for that. So one question about if nodes can be located in different network segments with slow link. That will always cause issues, right? Because you are transferring large amounts of data when you're reloading your apps. It's going to be easier to manage that now, since you can actually have nodes dedicated for certain groups, right? So maybe you can have different storage areas for those apps. I would say the recommendation is probably still to not cluster those nodes. Just you can still manage them in the same management console, but keep them as separate nodes, right? I don't see a huge reason to cluster them in that case, since if you're not going to load balance between them anyway, it doesn't really add a lot of benefit. Some questions about the actual client performance. So Ajax versus plugin. I know for a fact that there are improvements coming on that as bug fixes. Ajax client is definitely the preferred client going forward. It's where we want people to be in general. So performance issues on that are being focused on quite a lot. Some of those issues are browser related, right? IE, for example, is pretty terrible at handling large tables and such, but that's improving, and we also see it improving from a browser perspective. Even in IE, we see improvements if you're on the latest version, for example. So here's actually a great question. Are dedicated tasks also available in single node environments? I haven't tested that. that is a really good question. I think I want to test that straight after this session. I mean, generally these features are definitely more useful in a big cluster, but I could see the need for having dedicated tasks in a single node environment as well. If you have a bit of an unpredictable schedule and you really need to make sure that certain tasks are prioritized, I will give it a try and update it on community when I know. That's a good question. So what do you think, Michael? Are we running out of time or time for one more?
Actually, we have time for one more, actually.
Yeah.
And
So yeah, there's one question about future compatibility. QVWs built with 1120, will they work seamlessly with 1210? So we always try to make sure that we are backwards compatible, of course. The changes are not that big when it comes to QVW functionality between these versions. So I would expect this to work almost flawlessly. That said, it's always recommended to test your applications, even just in the desktop client in 1210 first, to make sure that the look and feel is the same, to make sure that your functionality is the same. That's always best practice. Sometimes there are small changes in layout or bug fixes that impact the functionality. So yeah, you can hear that I work in support. So definitely test things before you deploy them.
okay, well, thank you. We hope you enjoyed this session, and well, actually, thank you, Per, for presenting. We appreciate getting experts like you to share with us like this. Want to let you know the recordings and the Q&A will be available in the support community soon. In the coming days, you're going to receive a survey. We look forward to your feedback. We want to hear from you. And again, here is where you can find the recording of this session and previous sessions on the Qlik community. Now, for our next Support Techspert Thursday, will be held December 15th. Let's see, I believe, let me switch the sides here. There we go. That presentation will be Understanding QlikSense Performance. That should be pretty interesting for those that are running QlikSense. And if you have any questions or additional comments or suggestions, please contact us at supportprograms@qlik.com. Here's our legal disclaimer, as you've seen before. And once again, I want to thank you and have yourself a great rest of the day.